2 in the morning, on the 14th of March, 2026, the Expeditionary Sea Base, USS Lewis B puller drifted in the heavy swells of the Arabian Sea. For the first time in 3 decades, the United States was about to take a hammer to the eyes of a sovereign nation. Whether the elite Marine raiders could strike 7 targets at once without triggering a full-scale regional war remained to be seen. The air on the flight deck was a humid cocktail of jet fuel and salt spray. Darkness was absolute, save for the dim green glow of night, vision goggles reflecting off the visors of the boarding teams. 140 operators from the 1st Marine Raider Battalion moved with practiced, silent efficiency across the steel deck. They were divided into 7 strike elements, each assigned to a specific high-frequency coastal radar node along the Iranian coastline. The massive rotors of 14 MH-60 Mike helicopters began to turn, their low-frequency thrumming vibrating through the soles of the operators' boots. Each man carried over 60 pounds of gear, including specialized breaching charges, satellite communications arrays, and suppressed 7.62mm rifles. The mission, designated Operation Blind Man's Bluff, was a direct response to increasing harassment of commercial shipping in the Strait of Hormuz. For weeks, the stave Iranian coastal radar network had been providing precision tracking data to fast-attack craft and anti-ship missile batteries. This data allowed them to swarm international tankers with terrifying accuracy. The objective tonight was simple but absolute: the total physical destruction of those 7 radar arrays, rendering the Iranian coastal defense system unable to track or target friendly vessels. Inside the briefing room of the USS Lewis B puller, the commanding officer of the task force had been clear. This was not a diplomatic mission or a show of force. This was a surgical amputation of the enemy's situational awareness. To succeed, the raiders had to hit all 7 sites within a 90-second window. If even one site remained active, it could vector interceptors or surface-to-air missiles against the extraction fleet, turning a raid into a massacre. The tactical plan relied on extreme, low-level flight. The 14 MH-60 Mike helicopters would fly at an altitude of less than 15 meters above the water. At this height, the curvature of the earth and the clutter of the sea spray would hide them from the very radar systems they were sent to destroy. The pilots were flying on internal navigation and terrain-following sensors, maintaining a speed of 140 knots through the pitch-black night. On the flight deck, Strike Team Alpha, led by Captain Marcus Thorne, approached the lead helicopter. The team consisted of 20 men, including 2 combat controllers and a demolition specialist. Their target was the primary search radar located near the port of Jask, at coordinates 25 degrees 38 minutes north, 57 degrees 46 minutes east. This site was the linchpin of the entire network. If Team Alpha failed, the other 6 raids would be for nothing. Thorne felt the weight of his equipment as he climbed into the cavernous hold of the helicopter. The smell of hydraulic fluid and recycled air filled his lungs. A familiar, cold comfort before a jump or a raid. The crew chief gave a sharp thumbs-up signal under the dim infrared lights. One by one, the aircraft lifted off the deck, their noses dipping forward as they gained airspeed. They did not use radios. They did not use navigation lights. They were a ghost fleet, carved out of the darkness and propelled by the singular will of the Marine Corps. As the sea base faded into the distance behind them, the raiders checked their weapons one last time. The metallic click of bolts being racked and the raspy sound of Velcro being tightened were the only noises over the roar of the engines. Outside the open cabin doors, the black water of the Arabian Sea was a blurred sheet of iron only feet below the landing gear. The salt spray occasionally lashed in the cabin, stinging the exposed skin of the operators. To the north, the Iranian coastline was a jagged line of shadow against the slightly lighter sky. Somewhere in that darkness, Thousands of Iranian Revolutionary Guard personnel were manning their posts, unaware that 14 American helicopters were currently screaming toward them just above the wavetops. The strategic silence was heavy, a physical pressure that seemed to grow as the distance closed. Every man in the formation knew that in less than 40 minutes, the night would erupt in fire. The flight path was a zigzag route designed to avoid known listening posts and commercial shipping lanes. The helicopters moved in pairs, spread out across 50 miles of ocean to approach their 7 targets from different angles. This dispersion was essential for the simultaneous timing of the strike. On Thorne's wrist, the digital countdown timer glowed a soft amber. 28 minutes to the beach. 28 minutes until the first Marine raider stepped onto Iranian soil. The mission was a gamble of the highest order, but the professional discipline in the cabin was unshakable. There was no chatter, no nervous movement. There was only the steady, rhythmic vibration of the airframe and the cold focus of men who had spent years preparing for this exact moment. The Ghost Fleet was closing the gap, and the eyes of the Coastal Defense Network were about to be put out for good. 2:15 in the morning, the Strait of Hormuz. The 14 MH-60 Mike helicopters were now less than 20 miles from the Iranian coastline. The flight lead, callsign Warhorse 1, felt the heavy vibration of the airframe as the pilot pushed the aircraft down to a mere 10 meters above the waves. The salt spray was a constant, abrasive presence, coating the windshields in a fine white crust that the wipers struggled to clear. High above them, orbiting at 30,000 feet, a pair of EA-18 Golf Growler electronic warfare jets began their work. The Growlers, launched from a carrier strike group 200 miles to the south, were invisible to the naked eye. However, their presence was felt in the electronic spectrum as they flooded the Iranian air defense frequencies with a wall of digital noise. This electronic shroud was designed to blind any secondary sensors that might catch a glimpse of the low-flying helicopters. On the deck of the lead MH-60 Mike, Captain Thorne watched the green glow of his tactical tablet. The screen showed 7 blue icons moving in perfect synchronization towards 7 red dots on the coast of the Islamic Republic. Each red dot represented a sophisticated radar installation, some of them Russian-made systems, others indigenous designs. These sites were protected by layers of security, including anti-aircraft guns and rapid response infantry units. The Marine raiders were under strict orders to avoid engagement until the moment of the strike. If a single helicopter was spotted, the entire operation would transition from a stealthy raid to a desperate extraction. The air in the cabin was thick with the smell of diesel exhaust and the metallic tang of the weapons being checked once more. To the east, Team Bravo was approaching the radar node at Bandar Jask. Their coordinates were 25 degrees 38 minutes north, 57 degrees 46 minutes east. The terrain there was rugged, with limestone cliffs rising sharply from the narrow strip of beach. The pilots of the MH-60 Mike helicopters used their forward-looking infrared sensors to navigate the treacherous coastline. They were looking for a small, cleared area less than 500 meters from the radar dome. This landing zone had been identified by satellite imagery 48 hours prior to the mission. As the aircraft crossed the surf line, the sensation of speed changed instantly. The ocean was a flat, featureless void, but the land was a blur of rocks, scrub brush, and man-made structures. The helicopters flared hard, their noses rising as the pilots bled off airspeed in a matter of seconds. The downwash from the rotors kicked up a massive cloud of sand and dust, momentarily blinding the door gunners. Before the wheels even touched the dirt, the side door slid open with a heavy metallic clatter. The Marine raiders began to spill out, moving in low, crouched positions to clear the immediate perimeter. The heat on the ground was intense, even at 2 in the morning. The temperature hovered at 32 degrees, and the humidity felt like a wet blanket draped over the operator's shoulders. Each strike team had exactly 12 minutes to reach their target, set the charges, and return to the extraction point. There was no room for error, and no time for second-guessing. The silence of the desert, was broken only by the distant hum of the helicopter engines as they lifted off to wait in a low-profile orbit 5 miles out at sea. Team Alpha, led by Captain Thorne, found themselves on a steep incline overlooking the primary radar site. The radar dome was a white, skeletal structure that loomed against the stars like a giant, sightless eye. Thorne could see the flickering lights of the guard shack 300 meters to the south. The Iranian sentries were visible through his night vision goggles, leaning against their vehicles and smoking cigarettes. They had no idea that 20 elite Marine operators were currently closing the distance, moving through the shadows like mountain lions. The raiders moved in two-man buddy teams, leapfrogging across the open ground. They used the natural contours of the land to stay below the line of sight of the security cameras. The demolition specialist, Sergeant Miller, carried 30 pounds of C4 plastic explosive and thermite grenades. His job was to ensure that the radar's sensitive electronics were not just broken, but vaporized. As they reached the outer perimeter fence, Thorne signaled for the cutters. The sharp snap of wire being severed was the only sound in the stillness of the Iranian night. In 6 other locations along the coast, identical scenes were playing out in a choreographed dance of destruction. From the northern reaches of the strait to the eastern edges of the Gulf of Oman, the raiders were in position. The electronic warfare from the EA-18 Gulf Growlers continued to suppress the long-range communications of the Iranian military. The trap was set, and the tension was a coiled spring. Thorne checked his watch. The synchronized strike window was now less than 5 minutes away. The raiders began to plant the charges on the base of the radar tower and the cooling units for the main computer banks. Each explosive was wired with a dual redundant detonator and a satellite-linked trigger. If the manual signal failed, the charges would blow based on a pre-programmed timer. Miller worked with a calm, surgical precision, taping the blocks of C4 to the structural supports. He knew exactly where to place the explosives to ensure the entire tower would collapse under its own weight. Thorne kept his suppressed rifle leveled at the guard shack, his finger resting lightly on the trigger guard. The humidity continued to rise, and the smell of the sea was replaced by the dry, dusty scent of the Iranian interior. The minutes ticked by with agonizing slowness. Every man in the strike force was hyper-aware of their surroundings, listening for the sound of a startled shout or the roar of an approaching engine. They were deep inside hostile territory, and the only thing protecting them was the darkness and their own professionalism. The command to execute the strike was imminent, and the eyes of the Coastal Defense Network were about to be shut forever. 2:25 in the morning, the coastal stretches of the Islamic Republic of Iran, while Team Alpha secured the perimeter at the Jask radar site, 6 other Marine Raider elements were hitting their marks with surgical precision across 400 miles of coastline. This was the moment of the 7 daggers, a synchronized infiltration that relied on every team reaching their objective within a 90-second margin of error. On the flagship USS Lewis B puller, the Joint Task Force commander watched a digital display where 7 green icons pulsed steadily. Each icon represented a strike team that had successfully transitioned from their MH-60 Mike helicopters to the final assault positions. Team Charlie was operating at the most dangerous of the 7 locations, a radar installation situated just 10 miles outside the major naval base at Bandar Abbas. The coordinates were 27 degrees 11 minutes north, 56 degrees 16 minutes east. Unlike the rugged cliffs of Jask, this site was located on a flat, sandy spit of land heavily patrolled by Iranian Revolutionary Guard motorized units. The raiders of Team Charlie had to move through knee-deep salt marshes, the black mud sucking at their boots with every step. The air here was stagnant and smelled of rotting vegetation and sulfur. Despite the difficult terrain, the 20 operators of Team Charlie moved in perfect silence. They used the low-lying coastal fog as natural concealment, their thermal optics cutting through the mist to identify the heat signatures of the base security. 200 meters away, an Iranian sentry paced the length of a concrete pier, the glowing cherry of his cigarette the only light in the darkness. The raiders did not engage. Their mission was not to clear the base of personnel, but to render its technology useless. By 2:35 in the morning, all 7 teams had confirmed their status via encrypted burst transmissions. Team Delta was in position at the Kuistok node. Team Echo had breached the perimeter at Sirik. Teams Foxtrot and Golf were at their respective targets further south near the border with Pakistan. The raiders had placed a total of 480 pounds of C4 plastic explosives across the 7 sites. Each charge was positioned against the critical structural supports of the radar towers or the hardened casings of the signal processors. The mechanical precision of the operation was a testament to the thousands of hours the Marine raiders had spent in simulation. In the darkness of the Iranian night, men like Sergeant Miller at the Jask site were completing the final wiring of the detonation circuits. Miller used a small infrared penlight, visible only to those wearing night vision goggles, to check the connections on the satellite-linked triggers. The smell of the C4 was faint but distinct, a chemical, marzipan-like scent that signaled the lethality of the work. Inside the command center of the USS Lewis B puller, the atmosphere was one of controlled tension. The electronic warfare specialists reported that the Iranian integrated air defense system remained unaware of the intrusion. The EA-18 Golf Growlers continued to ghost the frequencies, creating a digital hall of mirrors that kept the Iranian operators focused on phantom contacts hundreds of miles out at sea. The gap between the raiders and the enemy was closing to nothing. Back at the primary site near Jask, Captain Thorne felt the humidity soaking through his combat shirt. His team was now less than 5 minutes from the extraction window. He looked through his optics at the massive radar array, a billion-dollar piece of technology that was now little more than a pile of scrap metal waiting for a spark. He could see the rotating arm of the radar, sweeping the horizon in a rhythmic, mechanical motion that would soon be stilled forever. The raiders began their tactical withdrawal from the immediate blast zones. They moved back toward their designated extraction points, where the MH-60 Mike helicopters were already beginning their low-level approach from their holding patterns. The coordination of the movement was handled by the combat controllers, who used silent laser designators to mark the landing zones for the incoming pilots. Every man was hyper-aware that the moment the charges detonated, the Iranian military would erupt into a state of total mobilization. On Thorne's wrist, the digital timer reached the 60-second mark. The 7 daggers were held at the throat of the Iranian coastal defense network. The raiders had infiltrated one of the most heavily defended coastlines in the world without firing a single shot. But the period of silence was about to come to a violent and absolute end. Thorne gripped the handguard of his rifle and signaled his men to take cover behind a limestone ridge. The countdown to the strike was in its final seconds, 2:45 in the morning. The dark, jagged coastline of the Islamic Republic of Iran. The 7 strike teams had reached their final fallback positions, ranging from 500 to 800 meters from the target structures. The Marine raiders were now invisible ghosts pressed into the sand and rock, their eyes locked on the digital displays of their tactical tablets. The humidity had peaked, and a thin layer of condensation coated the thermal lenses of their optics. Every man held his breath. The only sound, the distant, rhythmic wash of the Gulf against the shore. Captain Thorne, positioned behind the limestone ridge near Jask, felt the vibration of the MH-60 Mike helicopters before he heard them. The extraction birds were less than 2 miles out, flying at 10 meters, their rotors carving through the thick, salty air. On the USS Lewis B puller, the mission commander gave the final authorization. The command was a single word, transmitted via encrypted satellite burst to the 7 detonators simultaneously. The night did not just break, it vanished. At coordinates 25 degrees 38 minutes north, 57 degrees 46 minutes east, the primary radar tower at Jask erupted. The demolition charges, placed with surgical precision by Sergeant Miller, detonated in a synchronized sequence. A massive white-hot flash bleached the sky for 3 miles in every direction, followed instantly by a shockwave that slammed into the raiders' chests like a physical blow. The limestone ridge groaned, under the pressure of the blast. The 400-foot steel tower did not simply fall, it disintegrated. The C4 had severed the main structural torpedoes pillars at the base, while the thermite charges vaporized the sensitive signal processing arrays at the top. 10,000 tons of steel twisted and groaned, screaming as the metal was torn apart by the heat and kinetic energy. The tower collapsed into its own footprint, a mountain of burning debris that sent a plume of black smoke and sparks 500 feet into the air. The smell of ozone and vaporized copper filled the air, sharp and metallic. In the next 3 seconds, 6 more flashes lit up the horizon along the coast, like a string of malevolent pearls. From Bandar Abbas to the Pakistani border, the eyes of the Iranian coastal defense network were being extinguished. At the Bandar Abbas site, the blast was so powerful it shattered the windows of the Iranian naval barracks a mile away. The raiders of Team Charlie, already moving toward their extraction point, watched as the secondary explosions from the radar's fuel generators sent tongues of orange flame licking into the dark sky. The silence that followed the initial detonations lasted exactly 4 seconds. Then, the Iranian coastal defense forces woke up. Alarms began to wail across 7 different military sectors, a discordant symphony of sirens and shouting. Searchlights at the Jask naval base swung wildly into the sky, their beams cutting through the smoke of the burning radar tower. From the guard shack Thorn had been watching, the Iranian sentries scrambled into their vehicles, tires screaming as they raced toward the wreckage. Extraction in 60 seconds, Thorn called out over the squad net. He didn't need to look back to know his men were moving. The raiders were already in a dead sprint toward the landing zone, their heavy boots pounding the dry Iranian earth. Behind them, the ruins of the radar site were a roaring furnace. The heat was so intense that the sand surrounding the base of the tower had begun to turn to glass. The gun mission was half over, but the most dangerous phase, the retreat under fire, was just beginning. As the first MH-60 Mike flared for landing, its nose high and its door guns trained on the approaching Iranian vehicles, the reality of the situation set in. The US had just conducted a massive, coordinated act of sabotage on Iranian soil. The diplomatic consequences were for the politicians in Washington. For the raiders on the Tepatent's ground, the only thing that mattered was the 500 meters of open ground between them and the safety of the helicopter. The night was no longer their ally. It was a theater of fire and chaos. 2:50 in the morning, the landing zone 300 meters south of the Jask radar ruins. The extraction was no longer a silent affair. The destruction of the 7 radar sites had acted as a starting pistol for every Iranian quick reaction force within 50 miles. On the ground at the primary Jask site, Captain Thorn and the 20 men of Strike Team Alpha were in a desperate race against 3 Iranian light transport trucks and a single BMP-2 armored vehicle racing up the coastal road. The MH-60 Mike helicopters sat on the deck, their rotors spinning at full power, creating a localized hurricane of dust and grit that stung the eyes of the retreating raiders. The Iranian vehicles were less than 400 meters away, their headlights bouncing erratically as they sped across the uneven terrain. Thorn dropped to one knee, signaling his anti-armor specialist. The air was thick with the smell of burning rubber from the nearby ruins and the sharp ozone scent of the recent demolition. The mission was transitioning from sabotage to a high-intensity fireboard. The trigger of the AT-4 anti-tank weapon was squeezed. The rocket shrieked from the tube with a backblast of white fire that scorched the dry earth and sent a cloud of dust 20 meters into the air. The projectile accelerated instantly, a streak of yellow light cutting through the darkness. The warhead punched straight through the engine block of the lead Iranian transport truck, detonating with a concussive roar that cracked eardrums. The vehicle erupted instantly into a ball of orange flame, the chassis twisting as the fuel tank disintegrated. The blast wave threw 2 nearby Iranian soldiers off their feet, their bodies tossed like ragdolls into the scrub brush. The following Iranian vehicles screeched to a halt, and soldiers scrambled into the ditch, opening fire with AK-47 rifles. Tracers zipped through the air, several rounds slamming into the fuselage of the MH-60 Mike helicopter with a rhythmic, metallic thud. The door gunner responded, his M240 machine gun spitting a continuous stream of lead that chewed through the thin metal of the Iranian trucks and sent sparks flying. Thick black smoke from the burning lead vehicle billowed across the landing zone, mixing with the dust from the rotor wash to create a choking, opaque fog. The shouting of the Iranian officers was drowned out by the scream of the turbine engines and the heavy thud of high-caliber rounds hitting the dirt. "Go, go, go!" Thorne screamed over the radio, his voice barely audible over the mechanical cacophony. The raiders scrambled into the open doors of the two helicopters, their movements a blur of practiced muscle memory. Sergeant Miller was the last man in, providing a final burst of suppressive fire from his 7.62mm rifle before diving onto the floor of the cabin. The pilots didn't wait for the wheels to settle. They pulled pitch, the helicopters lurching upward with a violent surge of power that pinned the men to the deck. As the aircraft gained altitude, the door gunners continued to pour fire into the Iranian positions below. From the air, the coastal road was a line of fire and chaos. The burning truck provided a morbid beacon, illuminating the Iranian soldiers as they tried to organize a pursuit. Thorne looked out the door as they banked hard toward the sea. To the north, he could see the other 6 radar sites still burning, orange glows spaced out along the dark curve of the coastline like a map of the night's success. The extraction from Bandar Abbas was proving even more difficult. Team Charlie was reporting heavy resistance from Iranian naval infantry. They had 2 personnel with minor shrapnel wounds, but all 20 operators were accounted for and airborne. The Joint Task Force commander on the USS Gerald R. Ford ordered the immediate launch of a combat air patrol of 4 FA-18 Super Hornets to provide a screen for the retreating helicopters. The Iranian air defense network was currently blind, but their interceptors could still fly by visual reference and ground-directed radio from inland sites. Inside the cabin of Thorne's MH-60 Mike, the atmosphere was one of grim focus. The medic was already moving among the men, checking for injuries. The smell of gun smoke and sweat was overpowering in the cramped space. Thorne checked his tactical tablet. The mission timer showed 3 hours and 12 minutes since they had left the sea base. In that time, they had dismantled the eyes of a regional power and engaged in a direct firefight on sovereign soil. The helicopters leveled off at 15 meters above the water, once again hiding in the sea clutter as they raced back toward the safety of the international waters. The first phase of the counter-harassment campaign was complete. 7 radar nodes were gone. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Navy was now operating in a blackout, unable to coordinate their swarms or guide their missiles. But as the raiders looked back at the burning coast, they knew the Iranian response would be swift and likely scale beyond the shoreline. 3:10 in the morning, over the pitch-black waters of the Gulf of Oman, the 7 extraction flights were now miles off the Iranian coast, but the danger had shifted from the ground to the air. While the coastal radar nodes were smoldering ruins, the inland Iranian integrated air defense system was fully mobilized. Strategic early warning sites near Shiraz and Kerman were broadcasting at maximum power, attempting to find the American ghosts through the digital fog. On the flight deck of the MH-60 Mike, the radar warning receiver began to chirp a steady, rhythmic tone that signaled a search radar was sweeping their position. High above the helicopters, the 4 FA-18 Super Hornets from Carrier Strike Group 11 banked into a defensive orbit. These fighters were the shield between the raiders and the Iranian Air Force. The lead pilot, call sign Vandal 1, adjusted his oxygen mask and checked his AN/SPY-6 radar display. The sky was cluttered with the electronic footprints of a nation going to war. Somewhere to the north, 2 Iranian 4 Phantom jets had scrambled from Bandar Abbas Air Base, their afterburners twin needles of blue flame, cutting through the stratosphere. Vandal 1. This is magic. You have 2 bogies, bearing 010, range 40 miles, closing at Mach 1.2, The voice of the E-2 Charlie Hawkeye controller crackled in the pilot's ears. The Hawkeye, orbiting over the center of the Gulf, was the eye in the sky for the entire operation. It coordinated the complex dance of fighters, tankers, and extraction helicopters. The Iranian pilots were flying blind without their coastal radar data, relying on directions from inland controllers. They were searching for the raiders' helicopters, but the Super Hornets were positioned to intercept. Vandal 1 flipped the master arm switch to armed. On his head-up display, the digital box surrounded the primary Iranian target. The Super Hornet carried a full load of AIM-120 advanced medium-range air-to-air missiles. The rules of engagement were clear. If the Iranians moved to intercept the helicopters, they were to be neutralized. In the cabin of Captain Thorne's helicopter, the Marine raiders were monitoring the air-to-air net. The tension was a cold weight in the room. They had survived the ground engagement, but they were now passengers in Sedat, a high-stakes aerial duel where they had no control. The smell of the cabin had shifted. The sharp scent of gun smoke was fading, replaced by the clinical, dry smell of the aircraft's air conditioning system working at maximum capacity to cool the avionics. Suddenly, the Growlers stepped up their game. The EA-18 Golf aircraft deployed their jamming pods, flooding the Iranian 4 Phantoms radar screens with a snowstorm of false targets. To the Iranian pilots, it appeared as if 100 American jets had suddenly appeared over the Gulf. This electronic deception forced the Iranians to slow down and attempt to sort through the noise, buying the Marine raiders another 10 minutes of flight time. Break, Vandal 1. You are cleared to engage if they cross the limit of advance. The Hawkeye controller barked. The Hawkeye controller barked. The Iranian Phantoms were now 20 miles from the extraction fleet, descending rapidly to search for the wave tops. The lead Super Hornet pilot felt the familiar surge of adrenaline as he pushed his throttles forward into afterburner. The roar of the twin engines filled the cockpit, and the G-force pressed him into his seat as he turned to meet the threat. The standoff lasted for 90 agonizing seconds. The Iranian pilots, realizing they were being painted by superior American fire control radars, facing a superior force, finally broke formation. They executed a high G-turn and retreated back toward the Iranian coast. They were unwilling to trade 2 of their few remaining operational fighters for a chance at a target they couldn't even see. The chirping in the raiders' headsets stopped. The radar warning receiver went silent. Threat is cold. Bogies are RTB, Vandal 1 reported, his voice calm and professional. The Marine raiders let out a collective breath they hadn't realized they were holding. The air screen had held. The black hole created by the destruction of the coastal radars had done its job. The Iranians simply didn't have the situational awareness to find a needle in a haystack, when the haystack was the entire Arabian Sea. On the horizon, the faint lights of the USS Lewis B puller and the escorting destroyers began to appear. The expeditionary sea base was a sanctuary of steel and light in the middle of the dark ocean. The helicopters began their final approach, slowing to 60 knots as they prepared to land. The mission was almost over, but the raiders knew that while the tactical phase was ending, the strategic fallout was only just beginning to ripple across the globe. 3:30 in the morning. The landing deck of the USS Lewis B puller. The first pair of MH-60 Mike helicopters touched down, with a heavy jar, their tires barking against the non-skid surface of the flight deck. Before the rotors had even begun to slow, the Marine raiders were out of the cabins, moving with the stiff, mechanical gait of men whose adrenaline was finally beginning to purge from their systems. The deck was a hive of controlled activity. Navy corpsmen and flight deck personnel in yellow and purple vests swarmed the aircraft, guided by the dim blue taxi lights that preserved the ship's low visibility profile. In the second helicopter to land, the team from Bandar Abbas Strike Team Charlie was already offloading their casualties. The 2 operators with shrapnel wounds were conscious, their faces pale under the green chemical lights of the cabin. They were quickly moved onto stretchers and whisked toward the ship's medical bay. The air on the deck was cooler now, the wind whipping over the bow and carrying away the acrid stink of spent brass. and burnt hydraulic fluid that clung to the raiders' uniforms. Captain Thorne stepped onto the deck, his boots feeling heavy after the frantic sprint in Jask. He did not head for the berthing areas. Instead, he and the other strike team leaders moved directly toward the Combat Information Center for a preliminary hot wash. The tactical reload of the force was already underway. Even as the operators stepped off, ordnance technicians were beginning to inspect the door guns and sensor balls of the helicopters, preparing the birds for a secondary launch should a retaliatory strike materialize. Inside the ship's skin, the atmosphere was clinical and intense. The logistics of the raid were being tallied in real time. In under 90 minutes, the teams had expended 480 pounds of high explosives, 12,000 rounds of never-signed 7.62mm ammunition, and 4 AT-4 rockets. More importantly, the mission had achieved its primary strategic objective. Satellite imagery, filtered through the E-2 Charlie Hawkeye, confirmed that all 7 radar nodes were dark. The fire from the burning towers was so intense, it was creating its own thermal bloom on the infrared sensors of the orbiting Super Hornets. The logistics of the operation extended far beyond the ammunition. In the ship's hangar bay, mechanics were already working on Thorne's helicopter, patching the 3 small arms punctures in the tail boom. The fuel teams were pumping thousands of gallons of JP-5 jet fuel into the thirsty tanks of the MH-60 Mike fleet. On the carrier USS Gerald R. Ford, 50 miles to the south, the pace was even more frantic as the strike group maintained a continuous daisy chain of tankers and fighters to keep the Iranian Air Force pinned to their inland bases. "Sit rep," Thorne barked. As he entered the debriefing room, he pulled off his helmet, his hair matted with sweat and dust. The intelligence officer pointed to a digital map of the strait. "The Iranian Navy is in total disarray, Captain. We've intercepted voice comms from their fast attack craft. They're literally shouting at each other because they can't get a data link from the coast. They're blind. 2 of their missile boats nearly collided 3 miles off the Thames because they were running without navigation lights and had no radar guidance to deconflict. The cost of the operation was being measured in more than just fuel and bullets. The Marine Raiders had successfully executed a medevac for their 2 wounded while still in a hot landing zone, a feat of coordination that required the pilots to hold a hover while the door gunners suppressed the Iranian BMP-2. The tactical stabilization of the wounded had begun at 500 feet above the water, with the medic performing a field dressing while the aircraft banked at 60 degrees. Despite the physical exhaustion, there was no celebration. The Raiders knew that the destruction of the radar network was only the opening move. By blinding the Iranian coastal defenses, the United States had seized initiative in the strait, but they had also kicked a hornet's nest. The next 12 hours would determine if this was a localized victory or the spark of a much larger conflagration. Thorne took a sip of lukewarm coffee, the bitter taste grounding him. He looked at the map, at the 7 blacked-out sectors of the Iranian coast. For now, the strait belonged to the ghosts. 4:30 in the morning. The bridge of the USS Gerald R. Ford and the headquarters of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Navy in Bandar Abbas. The tactical black hole created by the Marine Raiders was now absolute. For the first time in decades, the most strategic choke point on the planet, the Strait of Hormuz, was effectively invisible to the forces that sought to control it. On the master war screen of the Gerald R. Ford, the once dense network of Iranian sensor coverage had been replaced by a vast, empty void stretching from the northern entrance of the Gulf to the Gulf of Oman. The strategic silence from the Iranian side was more telling than any radio transmission. A detailed damage assessment, compiled from satellite synthetic aperture radar and signals intelligence, revealed the total ruin of the 7 Daggers mission. All 7 primary radar towers had been leveled. At the Jask site, the destruction of the signal processing hub had been so complete that the Iranian military would have to rebuild the facility from the foundation up. This was not a repair job. It was a total reconstruction project that would take months. if not a year, to complete. The heat from the thermite charges had melted the Russian-built circuit boards into a useless slag of silicon and copper. The impact on the Iranian integrated air defense system was catastrophic. Without the coastal nodes to provide low-level tracking, their surface-to-air missile batteries were limited to their own organic, short-range organic radars. This meant that U.S. and Allied aircraft could now operate with near impunity over the water, provided they stayed below the horizon of the inland mountaintop sensors. The eyes of the Iranian coastal defense were gone, and with them, the ability to coordinate the swarms of fast attack craft that had been the primary threat to commercial shipping. Inside the Iranian command centers, the atmosphere was one of chaotic desperation. Decrypted communications showed a complete breakdown in the chain of command. Local commanders were frantically requesting instructions from Tehran, while the Central Command was unable to provide a clear picture of what was happening on the coast. The lack of situational awareness had created a cascading failure of intelligence. Without the radar data, the Iranian shore-based anti-ship missile batteries were unable to lock onto targets, rendering their massive stockpiles of cruise missiles temporarily useless. The United States Navy moved immediately to exploit the gap. Carrier Strike Group 11 was already shifting its position, moving closer to the strait to demonstrate total control of the international shipping lanes. The USS Mason and the USS Stockdale, two Arleigh Burke-class destroyers, were ordered to transit the strait in a freedom of navigation operation. They moved with their radars at full power, a deliberate provocation, and a display of absolute confidence. They knew the Iranians could see them on high-altitude search radar, but they also knew the Iranians could no longer target them with the precision required for a strike. The logistical fallout for Iran was equally severe. The coastal defense network was a highly specialized, integrated system. Replacing 7 major nodes simultaneously meant diverting resources from other critical defense sectors. Intelligence indicated that the Iranian military was already moving mobile radar units from the border with Iraq toward the coast in an attempt to plug the gap. However, these mobile units lacked the range and the processing power of the permanent sites the Marine raiders had destroyed. In the medical bay of the USS Lewis B Puller, the 2 wounded Marine raiders were in stable condition. The surgical team had removed several pieces of steel shrapnel from one operator's leg, a grim reminder of the close-quarters fight on the coastal road. The costs were real, but in the cold calculus of regional power, the price was considered low. For the loss of a few crates of ammunition and a handful of surgical staples, the United States had achieved a strategic decapitation of the enemy's coastal awareness. As the sun began to rise over the Arabian Sea, the air was clear, and the visibility was 10 miles. The smell of the ocean was clean again, the acrid smoke of the burning radar sites now far to the north and east. The Strait of Hormuz remained a volatile and dangerous place, but for the first time in weeks, the predatory certainty of the Iranian coastal defense had been replaced by a profound and paralyzed uncertainty. The black hole remained, a silent monument to the effectiveness of the Marine raider strike. 6 in the morning. The horizon of the Arabian Sea began to glow with a pale orange light. As the sun crested the edge of the world, on the flight deck of the USS Lewis B Puller, the 14 MH-60 Mike helicopters were now chained down, their engines cold and their rotors silent. The Marine raiders of the 1st Battalion had already moved below decks to begin the long process of cleaning gear, debriefing intelligence officers, and finally, sleeping. The humidity of the night had burned off, replaced by the crisp, dry air of a desert morning. The mission, Operation Blind Man's Bluff, was no longer a kinetic action. It was now a permanent part of the regional strategic landscape. The final report, transmitted via high-priority flash precedents to the Pentagon and the White House, was a masterpiece of military efficiency. 7 targets engaged, 7 targets destroyed. Total Iranian radar coverage in the Strait of Hormuz reduced by 85%. 0 American aircraft lost. 2 personnel wounded in action, both expected to make a full recovery. The black hole in the Iranian integrated air defense system remained absolute, a massive gap in situational awareness that the Iranian military was still struggling to comprehend. The strategic results were immediate. By 7 in the morning, the first convoy of international oil tankers began their transit through the strait, escorted by the destroyers USS Mason and USS Stockdale. The Iranian fast attack craft, which had spent weeks harassing these very vessels, remained largely pierside or moved in small, uncoordinated patterns near the coast. Without the God's eye view provided by their coastal radars, the Iranian commanders were unwilling to risk their assets against a U.S. Navy that now held every tactical advantage. The destruction of the radar network had also forced a diplomatic shift. The Iranian government, faced with a sudden and total loss of coastal control, was forced to temper its rhetoric. They could not retaliate effectively without a target picture, and they could not acquire a target picture without rebuilding their entire infrastructure. The raid had not just destroyed steel and silicon, it had destroyed the Iranian sense of impunity in the strait. The Marine raiders had effectively rewritten the rules of engagement in a single night. Inside the berthing area of the USS Lewis B puller, Captain Thorne sat on the edge of his rack, finally pulling off his heavy combat boots. The smell of the ship, a mix of industrial cleaner, diesel, and salt, was a grounding presence. On a small television monitor, in the corner, a news feed showed grainy, thermal footage of the Jask radar tower collapsing. The world was just beginning to find out what had happened in the darkness, but for Thorne and his men, the work was done. The success of the mission underscored the unique capability of the Marine raiders. While the world focused on carrier, strike groups, and stealth bombers, it was 140 men with plastic explosives and night vision goggles who had truly changed the balance of power. They had operated in the shadows, struck with the force of a sledgehammer, and vanished before the enemy even knew they were there. The 7 daggers had been driven home, and the scars would remain for years to come. As the USS Lewis B puller turned its bow toward the open ocean, leaving the Iranian coast far behind, the mission was officially logged as complete. The Strait of Hormuz was clear. The eyes of the adversary were put out, and the Marine raiders had once again proven why they are the scalpel in the hands of the United States military. The silence over the radio waves was the most profound victory of all.